Well, all right, Nijay, how's it going? How are you, man?
Doing well, doing well. It's been a busy week with my book coming and everything, but really, really excited to be talking to you today.
Yeah, I can't imagine. It's funny because Cody Matchett, who's a friend of mine, wrote a book with Scott McKnight on Revelation, and it was interesting to watch the behind the scenes of the book process of like seeing them write it so long ago, then going through all of the like rewriting phase. To by the time they got to the book, I was like, man, I feel like I personally, not that they were, but I was like, I feel like I personally would be like, I'm ready for this thing to be over. I'm glad it's out.
Yeah,
I'm done
yeah,
talking about it. Where it's a lot of work. I don't think people always realize that. But for you, and for this book, can you just give a little intro to who you are for those who maybe don't know, and what you do, and what are some of the books you've been putting out lately?
sure. Thanks. So yeah, my name is Nijay Gupta, and I live in Portland, Oregon. I actually teach at Northern Seminary in Chicagoland. It's a
Hmm.
little suburb of Chicago, but I taught at George Fox University in Oregon for 6 years, which is what brought us out to Oregon from upstate New York before that. But my job is I teach New Testament mostly through Zoom, but I travel to Chicago every now and again.
Hmm.
And I love living in Oregon. Beautiful, beautiful place. You got wonderful coffee culture,
Yeah.
electric bicycles, all of that, all the fun stuff here in Portland. Yeah, I teach New Testament. I met my wife in seminary, Amy, and I kind of was deciding on door number one, ministry, or door number two, academics.
Hmm.
But I actually try to bring both of those things together because I get the privilege of teaching and working with pastors for my job. So I love it. And then, as you kind of indicated, when I get a chance, I try to do some writing. I'm an introvert. I love sitting at home with a good book, listening to music and researching. And I think the reason I write so much, people ask why I write so much, like I'm running out of time. It's just because I love learning. I
Hmm.
just love learning new things. I love um, just better understanding things, trying to kind of take things apart and understand them. And then once I've learned them, I love passing on what I've learned to other people, and so that's kind of the motivation behind it all. What have I been doing lately? I think my niche is to read all this really nerdy academic stuff in journals and in really expensive $300 monographs, which I don't buy, by the way. I use the library, but all these expensive monographs, and then I try to repackage that so that I
Hmm.
can bring the best insights, the most accurate information to what I call the ground level. So you have ivory tower scholars. I'm not
Yeah.
an ivory tower scholar. I'm like lobby. I'm a lobby scholar. So I really want to bring it in the lobby and then invite people in to learn. And
Hmm.
so I kind of think of myself as a ground level theologian, if you could call me that. So books I've been working on lately that have come out last few years. I wrote a book that is trying to offer New Testament theology to lay people. It's
Hmm.
called 15 New Testament Words of Life. And I basically just talk about how the Bible talks about the very things that we care about the most: friendship, life, death, suffering, hope.
Hmm.
Some people get this perception the Bible is about this other world of like cherubs flying around and like floating around on a cloud. The vast majority of the Bible is talking about real life,
Hmm.
and it's talking about it from a divine perspective, but it's not talking about things that don't relate to real life
Yeah.
most of the time. And then I wrote a book, published a book last year called "Tell Her Story,"
Hmm.
um, about women who led, taught, and ministered in the early church. I really wanted to uncover those hidden figures, to use language from Margot Lee Shetterly's famous book, Hidden Figures. These hidden figures that most of us never heard of growing up: Yodia, Syntyche, Tryphena, Tryphosa, Persis, Mary of Rome, Damaris, the mother of Rufus, the sister of Nereus, Nympha. Like, these are all women that are leaders, that are talked about in the Bible. Why don't we talk about them?
Hmm.
And why don't we learn about them? And why don't we appreciate and even admire them for their faith, courage, ministry, leadership, resilience, hope, and so forth? And then the latest is Strange Religion, that just came out in February, late February.
Yeah, and you've also got, I think that's your commentary back there for the Story of God commentary
Not, but
series.
it's same series. Yeah.
And
I wouldn't be that showy, Aiden.
where you're
Come on.
like, check this out. This is my book.
Right behind me. No, that's my friend Lynn Cohick's book. But yeah, I published a book, a commentary. But sometimes lay people, they don't get what commentaries are. So
No.
they're basically like Bible studies on steroids.
Mhm.
And some commentaries are like 1,000 pages long. They're
Yeah.
really dense. They're really dry and boring. It's like reading the encyclopedia. Some people actually like reading the encyclopedia, but my wife likes reading the encyclopedia. But then you have kind of devotional level commentaries that are trying to use academic information, but the audience is pastors and lay people, and that's this series that you're talking about, Zondervan's Story of God Bible Commentary Series, which is fantastic.
So
Scott McKnight's the editor. His first volume on the Sermon on the Mount is just epic. It's one of my favorite commentaries of all time. Lynn Cohick, another great scholar, has written for the series. Mike Bird, who you should have on your show if you haven't, wrote on Romans. He has a fantastic commentary. So I did Galatians. And just excited to be, it's like it's in my world, Aiden, it's like being asked to be in a Marvel movie.
Yeah, where you're like, I am Iron Man.
Yeah, that's right. Like, okay, I'm not RDJ, but like I'll be like one of these side characters that come in and as long as I can say I'm within the Zondervan cinematic universe.
That's so cool. And those commentaries are great, but we're not here to talk about those. We're here to talk about your new book. So Strange Religion, this book really intrigued me when I saw it, and I was like, oh, I'm so excited for this. Just because I love early church stuff and looking into this. And I feel like a lot of Christians often haven't in the West fully grasped what the early church was like. And so for you in writing this book and titling it something like Strange Religion, and it being about how Christianity, when it rolled on the scene, was seen as like a strange religion. What does that mean? What is your premise of this book for people who have no idea? What are you trying to dive into in this thing?
Yeah, the subtitle is a clue at how the first Christians were weird, dangerous, and compelling. And I mentioned that I live in Portland, Oregon. When tourists come here, they love to go downtown to the famous Keep Portland Weird sign, which is this kind of billboard right by Voodoo Donuts. And the reason why Portland has been known for that weirdness is this idea of be yourself, be different. And it's all about nonconformity. And that can be taken to extreme, and it can become kind of a virtue without significance sometimes. But I thought that was actually an appropriate label for the early Christians, because to deviate from the norm of religion and society to the degree that Christians did was, and to gain a hearing, was essentially unheard of. And so, in order to explain that, we have to understand what Roman religion was like. So can I just paint a quick picture of that? So we have to, in America today, we start with Christendom, and then now we're in post-Christendom. So we don't really know what it's like to live in a polytheistic state, religion, society that is what we call pagan. But in the Roman world, you might have heard before Romans were polytheistic. That doesn't really tell you what religion was like, except they had multiple gods. Rome did have a tolerance policy that, they allowed people to bring in their native gods when they conquered a nation or when people kind of immigrated to Rome. But Rome had kind of a state-mandated religion, which would be the religion of the Roman gods that we know from the Greek world as Zeus and so forth. If you watched Percy Jackson, the new series, my family watched it. It's actually a very good representation of that world. But the Romans had different names for them, like Jupiter, Juno, Mars, Venus, and so forth. You were obligated to worship these gods because this wasn't seen, the way they used language of religion wasn't seen as a hobby, which is the way it's often perceived in modern times. Like, oh, I feel like I should be getting into religion to get spiritually healthy, kind of like align my chakras or something like that. It's seen as sort of like a spiritual fitness routine. And that is definitely not the way it was in the Roman world. It was obligatory And there's a phrase that often appears in the Roman literature, and the phrase is Pax Deorum, which means peace of the gods.
Mm.
And we can maybe paraphrase that as peaceful coexistence with the gods who rule over us.
Mm.
So when you came into the Roman Empire by slavery or another means, you were obligated to worship the gods on high. And society was seen as this great pyramid of power. And you have, the greatest number of people at the bottom, slaves, immigrants, low class, poor. And then as you go up the ladder of hierarchy of power and status, you get fewer and fewer people.
Mm.
And so then you have like middle class, kind of with the equestrian class, which is kind of a high class. Then you have the ultra high class, the senatorial class. Then you have the imperial network of Caesar and all of that. And Caesar stood at kind of the cusp between heaven and earth. He was kind of he's referred to as Pontifex Maximus, which means the great bridge builder between the mortals and the gods. And then you had a whole hierarchy of gods. So you kind of had lower level gods like demigods, deified heroes, things like that. Then you had, a variety of foreign gods that were seen as powerful. So Yahweh, the God of Israel, would have probably been up there in the eyes of Romans as a super powerful god. Not the very top, because the very top you have the Olympians, and at the tippy top you have Jupiter, and his title was best and greatest. He corresponds to Zeus. So if you're going to be a part of the Roman Empire and you're going to survive, you have to integrate into that. Even if you bring in your own god, you have to find a way to integrate your god. So let's give an example from the Jewish religion, Judaism. Now they worshipped one god, but they wanted to survive in the Roman world. So kind of some of the leaders made a deal with Rome. We're not going to make a sacrifice to Caesar, but we'll regularly make a sacrifice to our God, asking our God to bless Caesar. And that was seen as like a acceptable alternative. So there were kind of, Rome was kind of policing foreign cults, foreign religions, to make sure they integrated in some way into the Pax Deorum, peaceful coexistence with the gods who rule over us. And on a number of levels, this is where we get into the premise of my book, the strangeness of the early Christians. On a number of levels, the Christians just simply refused to fit into that system, and that made them deviant. So deviant would be the sociological equivalent to the term weird. So weird doesn't mean their hairstyles or their music preferences. Weird means they were social, political, religious, economic, and cultural deviants. And so let me give you some examples, and then we can kind of get into questions that you have. So let's say I came to you and I said, Aiden, I have an idea for a new school, a new kind of school.
Yeah.
You're like, oh, that sounds great. Tell me about it. I said, okay, but we don't have teachers, classrooms, textbooks, or a building. You're like, okay, but what actually is that? Is this University of Phoenix? No, it's not University of Phoenix. This is what the Christians were doing, because the staple infrastructure of religion was temples, priests, sacrifices, and statues. The whole idea of Roman worship was the gods live in heaven, they live in Olympus, but they visit the earth in certain places, certain hotspots. So if you want to pay respect, if you want to appease the gods, you bring a material sacrifice to a priest at a specific location. And then you pray and you pay homage and reverence in front of a statue. And the statues weren't just statues. They were seen as like avatars of the gods. And so you have all these accounts of Romans saying that these statues can turn their heads. They would sometimes give the time of day to the statue so they know. They would face the statue with a nice view. They would take sometimes the statues to go on a retreat or to go to the bathroom. They would change the clothes of the statues sometimes, or put jewelry on the statues, or sometimes coat on the statue to keep it warm in winter. So they knew that somebody made that statue out of stone or clay or whatever, but they actually thought the gods visit us. One scholar, Nigel Spivey, says he refers to them as bionic statues in the sense that they have living properties. I use terminology not in the book, but in an article, I use terminology. They have, you're going to like this if you're a nerd, Aiden. They have amphicosmic ontology. Ontology means being. Amphicosmic means they exist in two worlds at once. So the God exists on heaven, then he also exists on earth in and through the statue. But the statues don't move on their own. At least they don't walk away most of the time. So you had to be somewhere. And these Christians come along and they say, we don't have temples. Now, they did utilize the Jerusalem temple, but this is really interesting, Aiden. Tell me what you think about this. If you read Paul's letters, which are the earliest Christian literature we have, he wrote in the 40s and 50s. The Gospels were written probably slightly later than that. In Paul's letters, he never, ever tells Christians to go on pilgrimage anywhere. Think about that. Every religion at that time would encourage you, hey, save up your nickels and dimes. Put some money away in a piggy bank. Because one day you need to make it to Rome. It's kind of like Disney World for the people in the ancient world. You got to make it to Rome. You got to see the temple of Jupiter on the Capitoline Hill. It's like seeing the Eiffel Tower. It's like seeing the Colosseum. I mean, it's one of the great wonders of the world. Or you have to see the Temple of Artemis in Ephesus, or you have to see the Temple of the Jews in Jerusalem. There were these places or you have to see the Parthenon in Athens. There were these places you just absolutely had to see, had to go to and visit. And there is that sense that you're going to be in holy presence when you're there. It's going to be a phenomenological, spiritual, religious experience because you get to be close to the gods. Paul never says that. He never says, hey, you got to save up and make it to here. He believed that because of the Holy Spirit, because of Jesus Christ, no one place in the Roman Empire had less static in communicating with God than another place because the Holy Spirit resides in us. So they didn't have temples. They didn't have sacrifices. They didn't have material sacrifices. If a pagan, a Roman, visited a Christian assembly, a Christian meeting, one of the things that would stand out to them would be the fact there are no priests and there are no sacrifices. One of the closest comparatives to early Christians would be what are called Greco-Roman voluntary associations, which are these kind of social clubs, kind of like if you had a fraternity for adults. That was also like a Rotary Club or, my dad was in the Lions Club, something like that. If you had that and virtually everybody was in one. So it would be similar to like going out to the pub after work with your work friends. But it was more of a formal thing. Like go home, change, take a shower, then come to this pub and we'll have like kind of like almost like a union meeting, but there's lots of food and drink and frivolity and reveling and all this stuff. And so they often met in they didn't really often meet in temples, these clubs. They met in like pubs and maybe people's houses. And so someone might think they're at one of those or they went to a Christian meeting, but at these clubs, they would have sometimes priests. Someone would be designated a priest. They would have sacrifices. They would have offerings to the gods. Christians didn't have that. So they didn't have statues because that was forbidden. They didn't have temples. They didn't have priests. So what makes it a religion? And Rome had a designation that was kind of a kind of popular term, but not an official term, superstition, for a label of a dangerous religion, a religion that is going to threaten peace with the Roman gods. And so Judaism was sometimes referred to as superstition, but definitely early Christians, because you need to make sure that your relationship with the gods is heavily regulated. Heavily regulated. We just installed a new furnace here in our house, and we've been in this house for 10 years. We've never had to install a furnace until now. We had it installed. You have to have someone come and you have electrician approve, it's really expensive. It's kind of dumb, but it makes
Yep.
sense because they want to make sure that your house isn't going to explode.
Mm-hmm.
So you got to have somebody professionally install it, and then you have to have an electrician professionally certify it. It's kind of like that with ancient religions in Rome. If the foreign religion is going to come in, someone's going to have to make sure this thing is not going to blow up.
Mm.
And the Christians are like, we put this wire here, we stuck this thing in there, there's no lid on this, I put that screw in. Like, that's the way Romans would perceive the Christians.
Yeah.
Is, Christians, believe that this thing was great and good and true. But from a Roman perspective of many, there's this idea that this thing could blow at any time. Because this spirit is in everybody, and they can wield limitless power. They got the apostles here, and you just fall into their shadow and touch a handkerchief and you're healed. Like, no, we have mechanisms for how people go to doctors and, how people have power, but you guys can do all these miraculous things in an unregulated way. This is just a taste of some of the ways that Christians were weird and dangerous.
Yeah, well, that's really interesting, and it even brings to mind Jesus talking to the woman at the well, and how revolutionary it would be to be like, there's going to come a time when people aren't going to worship here or there, that people are going to worship God everywhere, and how strange to them. It wasn't just a Jewish theological question. It was actually this is so different than anything. With that being said, so now I'm off my question. So I'm curious.
I've stunned you.
Yeah, you've stunned me. It's just, so when a Roman, for example, let's say they were, I don't know, invited to the house church of wherever in Rome, they're going to go visit, and they would show up to whatever church looked like at that time. What would they find? So they would show up, and obviously it's different than what they would have imagined the Jewish temple was, where they don't have people in robes offering sacrifices. So what would an early church service look like back in the day? What would they have found?
Yeah, I mean, you have to start with what it was like in a Roman culture, Roman practices. It's heavily regulated. So, there's one ancient author who says there would be, at any ceremony, religious ceremony, there would be 4 religious inspectors involved. There would be the person reading the regulations. There'd be the person performing the ritual. There
would
be the
for
person
Greco-Roman worship.
Yeah, Roman.
Okay.
Roman, sacrifices or festival rituals. So there'd be a person reading the regulations. There'd be a person performing the regulations. There'd be a person checking the regulations to make sure it was done correctly. And there'd be a 4th person making sure that everyone was quiet. And so you can get that sense of I kind of liken it in some ways in the book to bomb disposal experts. You don't want this thing to blow up. So, it doesn't matter what's in your heart. It matters whether you're actually good at diffusing the bomb.
Yeah.
And so at these, the ceremonies were taken with the utmost seriousness. And then later on you would party, but you had these ceremonies that were very, they're almost like parades where there's decorum and there's rules and there's, sort of like a military parade or something. So someone showing up to a house church, I mean, a lot of this is speculation because we don't have a run through. So I'm just going to kind of shoot at the hip here and guess. As we transition from the Roman style of worship to a house church, I think they would get the sense of a completely different framework. So the framework of professional state Roman religion was the framework of politics. So going to a political event where there's a lot of pomp and decorum and professionalism and hierarchy and rituals and rules. And then I think when they show up to the house church, now we have to differentiate between Orthodox churches and whatever else is out there. So who knows? Let's say a Pauline church. I think they get the sense this is family time.
Mm.
Like you've kind of shown up to a large family gathering because you're meeting in a house. Often the person who's leading is the what's called the paterfamilias or the materfamilias, the household owner or manager. And so they're going to welcome you in, and there's hospitality, and we're going to wash your feet, we're going to take care of you. Would you like some hors d'oeuvres? Would you like some food? There's that sense of you've entered into family space. That's the impression we get from the language they use of the sacred kiss and of calling each other brothers and sisters. You show up, there's that sense of like you're not being treated as a peon, or they're not like checking your credentials, like, do you belong? There's that sense of like, welcome to our family time. And what do we know that happened? Well, we know they sang. And they sang, Pliny says they sang songs to Jesus as if to a god. And so they're going to sing. And I think there are multiple purposes of singing. I don't necessarily think they're singing pop versions of religious songs like we do today.
Yeah.
I'm not against that, by the way, today, but I don't think that's what they were doing. I think it'd be more like chanting. When we say singing about what they were doing, it's probably more similar to chanting or kind of an Anglican, where it's a unique form of music. I'm not saying only the Anglicans and Catholics have it right, but I do think that they understand more of what they were doing, which is singing these confessions of faith that are unifying, that are passing on their tradition, so forth. I think there would be teaching, but it wouldn't be like a sermon, like like a 35-minute TED talk. I don't actually mind that. We can talk about that later, but I don't think that's what they were doing. I think it was kind of like Bible study. They would be talking through the teachings of Scripture and the teachings of the apostles and the stories of Jesus. I think there would be the reading of Scripture, as we learned from the pastoral epistles. And because they would be drawing from the Jewish synagogue where reading of Scripture was common or normal. Okay, I don't know how charismatic you are, but I think there would have been the expression of spiritual gifts, including prophecy. Now, when we think prophecy, don't think crystal ball.
Yeah.
This isn't like that. Prophecy would be like, does anyone have a word from the Lord? And someone might have a word of encouragement from the Lord. And they might say, hey, Aiden, God's just given me this word to give to you, that I know you've been having a rough week, but the Lord has really impressed on me that, God's going to have something really special for you this week, and just be on the lookout for that. Things like that. Someone might have, maybe more like a true prophecy that is a little more predictive, but often it's not like at 3 p.m. lightning will strike your house. It's going to be like, and I don't imagine that happened all the time, but it's, I think that there would have, I don't think that one person talked the whole time. Let's put it that way. And I think that that's a huge difference between the modern evangelical church and the ancient church. I think there would be a host who would make sure things are running smoothly.
Yeah.
And that one of the things we learn in 1 Corinthians is that Paul loves order and harmony, not disorder and chaos. So I think the host played the role of order and harmony, make sure that the things that absolutely had to happen happened. But there was space given to the expression of spiritual gifts. We know a lot of that from 1 Corinthians. We know some of that from Ephesians. But we also know that we know so many names of people in churches at that time.
Yeah.
Because, I hate in churches today where you just parade the elders out like once a year to thank them for their service.
Yeah.
And other than that, you never hear from the elders. I'm thinking like the leaders of the church, mostly lay people, they're going to be involved every week in encouraging, in, chiming in, kind of like assistant coaches, things like that, volunteer coaches. And so there would be times of expression of spiritual gifts. I just think that would have been natural and normal to a spirit-filled community.
Hmm.
Lastly, there would be a meal. And I'm not talking little dry wafer
Yeah, yeah.
and little shot glass of grape juice. I'm talking like a real meal.
Hmm.
And I don't know if you know this, but in the ancient world, they would actually lay down for their meals. In fact, the dining room was called the triclinium, which means the kind of third room where people. The word "clin," the letters "clin," refer to lying down. So the same word that you use for what you do when you get on your bed at night is the exact same word that you use to what you do in the dining room. You lay down. So you're actually laying down. So you're in an intimate atmosphere when you're dining at someone's house, which is going to ramp up the stakes whenever Jesus is at someone's house.
Yeah.
He's lying down with these people. And so the Last Supper the painting doesn't give you a fair representation of that. But you're laying down in this intimate atmosphere, and in a competitive society like the Roman world, they would often put you in sort of circles of proximity to the food based on how important you are in society. But I imagine in Orthodox churches, they don't. And that would be a surprising difference. Think about going to a wedding, a friend's wedding, and how, you kind of gauge a relationship with your friend on how close you are to the head table, right?
Yeah.
You're like, oh, why am I put all the way back here with the kids? Or you're like, wow, they put me at table number 2. Like I should have bought a better gift. Like you kind of realize, well, it's kind of like that. And imagine if you go to a wedding with someone you barely know and they put you at the head table, you'd be like, oh my gosh, this is weird. I imagine and I hope that Christians do that sort of thing, because James says this. He says, rich person comes in, don't usher them to the front. Right? And a poor person comes in, don't hide them in the back. I think that replicates that notion that Christians shouldn't recognize you leave your status at the door when you come in. You're just a regular person when you step into these doors. And so I think they'd have this meal, and part of the meal is sharing Jesus Christ, but part of the meal is something that Dominic Crossan calls open commensality, which means when we come to this table, and the table was a center part of the service, we're all equals in the eyes of God. We're all sinners and we're all saints. And you're eating the same food. You have the same bodily needs. You all led to Jesus' crucifixion, and you all benefit from his resurrection, his death and resurrection. And the ideas of the sacred kiss, the ideas of passing the peace and so forth, the kiss of peace. We don't have to kiss each other, Aiden, if you don't want to. We don't have to kiss each other. But the idea of touch, I think, is important. And I know in a germ society that's tough. But the idea of embracing somebody, however we try to do that in our cultures, would have been crucial to their form of hospitality and acceptance of others who may even be our enemies and people that we don't agree with on a variety of issues that are important to us. So I'm going to tell you again, that's a lot of speculation. If you want to get Ben Witherington's take on it, he actually narrates an early Christian house church meeting in his book, A Week in the Life of Corinth. I think he does actually a really good job. It's maybe a little bit put on, a little overcooked, but it's probably the best representation I've seen. Another one is a scholar named Paula Gooder, has a couple of fiction novels. One of them is based on Phoebe. It's called Phoebe, a story. And then another was Lydia. The Phoebe one I'm using as a textbook with some students. She also does this sort of thing, and it's really helpful.
That's really interesting. How much time do I have you for before you have
Let's say another 20.
Another 20 minutes? Okay.
Yeah,
that's super fascinating. I want to dive into that a little bit later, probably at the end, and what maybe would be weird for an early Christian coming to a church today in the West. But before we do, so that's a lot of the worship and the way that they would have done things that were strange. But in your book, you also dive into the way Christians lived, because it wasn't just their
Yeah,
services and those
beliefs.
kinds
Yeah.
of things that were weird, but also the way that they interacted in society was seen as
Hmm.
very strange. And so, can you dive into some of that? What made Christians weird, not just in the way that they worshiped their God, but also then in the way that they chose to live their lives compared to what was normal?
Exactly. Well, one of the key chapters of my book is about the sociology of the early Christians and how it deviated from Roman sociology. So today we take kind of for granted the inherent worth and dignity of the individual, no matter who they are.
Hmm.
We've done that historically. Obviously, we don't always do that faithfully, but that's a cornerstone value of America. Um, and we actually get that from the early Christians. They were
Hmm.
the ones to first support, reinforce, spread this idea publicly. Jews already had a notion of this, but they were kind of a private people. They were known to be very insular. And
Hmm.
it's not that they didn't welcome outsiders, but they weren't going out there
Yeah.
promoting Judaism. The ways that the Christians were kind of, you could kind of think of Christians as centrifugal,
Hmm.
whereas Judaism was often centripetal. Centripetal. They're trying to draw people in, but they're not necessarily going out there. Christians, have this great commission. Um, so let me give you something to kind of capture your imagination here. There was a Roman statesman named Pliny, and not a Christian. And there's this famous letter he writes to a man named Tiro, who's a up and coming Roman officer. And Pliny wants to give him some advice. And he says to Tiro, um, I know that I've seen you cozying up to your subordinates, your inferiors. And he says, I know why you're doing it. You want to be buddy buddy. You want to have a good relationship with them so they'll listen to you. He says, but this is actually dangerous
Hmm.
because they're going to confuse you for a friend when you're really a superior.
Hmm.
And then Pliny gives this really famous line. He says, the most unequal thing is the appearance of equality where it doesn't exist.
Ah.
And what he means by that is society runs according to a very carefully laid out, stratified system, that hierarchy of power that I told you about earlier. And there can be and maybe should be equality within a class. But the idea that you will confuse or mix classes, Pliny thinks, is dangerous to society. This
Hmm.
happened in conversations about slaves and slavery. You many slaves. There were different kinds of slaves. There were slaves that worked for the government. They're called civic slaves. There were slaves that worked on like plantations and fields, agricultural slaves, and then there were household slaves. And there were many household slaves. Um, and there was a common pattern that if your slave grew up in your house, you're around them all the time, they almost become like family.
Hmm.
Because, I kind of think of the movie Gladiator. I don't know how old you are, Aiden, but I don't
Yeah.
know if you've seen the movie
Yeah,
Gladiator.
I have.
Okay, so you have, Maximus, and he has this slave,
Hmm.
right? And he has kind of a friendship relationship with this slave. He's almost like his son. Did
Hmm.
you sense that from the movie?
Yeah.
Yeah, and so you'd have that sort of situation, and so there are all these warnings from society, from the elites in society. We need to be careful to not get too familiar with our slaves.
Hmm.
You can have sex with them. You can, you know, give them a tip every now and again. It'd be common to tip your slaves, and over time they can maybe earn their freedom. But don't get too overly familiar. Like, make sure they know they're still slaves. And there's a famous statement made by Seneca. You have as many enemies as you have slaves, meaning you get too cozy and one day they're going to stab you in the back, literally.
Hmm.
And that's very similar to Pliny's statement about equality, that slaves are slaves, masters are masters. You can't confuse those categories.
Hmm.
You can't treat slaves as non-slaves. Well, Christians come along, and one of the statements that's repeated throughout the New Testament by a variety of writers is, in the Old English, it's God's not a respecter of persons, but we would say God doesn't have any favorites.
Hmm.
Or this is another way to say it, God doesn't recognize privilege.
Hmm.
That's probably the most un-Roman and dangerous thing in the whole Bible.
Interesting.
Because remember that pyramid of power?
Yeah.
The pyramid of power is built on the notion of privilege.
Mm.
And all of a sudden say we're going to flatten that out. We're not going to recognize that. The whole society will crumble.
Yeah.
Like a house of cards. You can't live that way.
Mm.
I use sometimes the analogy just for fun. If you went into an airplane just before the takeoff and said, we're going to change things up. We're going to move people in first class to the back, remove people back. Think about how upsetting that would be to people.
Yeah.
I get bumped up for free to first class sometimes, about one every 10 times, because, I've traveled a lot and I get all these points and whatnot. And I love being in first class. It is really, really nice. You get a little box of water. It's nice. And so I know the people in first class, especially ones that have bought it, they don't want to be in the back.
Yeah.
So think about that, but writ large everywhere. If society was like this everywhere, what would it be? What would it mean if you walked into an airplane and said, hey, I'm the CEO of this airline. I no longer recognize privilege, so we're going to change seats at random. But that's what the Christians said is true. Yeah. They said that's how God looks at things. And that makes sense of Galatians 3:28 when Paul says, in Christ there is neither Jew nor Gentile, slave or free, male and female. Paul's not erasing difference. He still believes that men are men, women are women, that Jews are Jews and Gentiles are Gentiles. But what he's saying is the Romans believe those demographic indicators determine your importance. And that importance determines your privileges in society. But because Jesus is the only son, and in that era, the son was the highest, the oldest son was the highest person in the household. Yeah. Christians enter into his one sonship. All Christians enter in his one sonship and receive all the privileges of his sonship. So that means we all get first class. Yeah. So the analogy the Christian uses is actually not the CEO going and saying we're going to do it random. He's saying we're going to renovate the airplane and upgrade everybody to first class. We're going to make the whole plane first class. Romans wouldn't like that because they say, how do we know who's elite? Yeah. But the Christians like that because they say, we don't care.
Yeah. There's so many rabbit holes I want to go down, but we don't have time for. It's just super interesting how different, even from our society has been Christian influence, but even there's still some of that out there, even in the church where I'm a pastor. And sometimes people act like I have almost different access to God because I'm a pastor. And it's just interesting to be like, no, that's not that's not how this thing works. That my prayers aren't more heard by Jesus because I'm a pastor. But yeah, we don't have time for that. Last question for you. And I think this is interesting, and I'm curious to hear your take on it. So the church in its early days would have been seen as strange by the people who didn't, who weren't Christian. It would have seemed super weird. And I've often imagined that if Paul was plucked from where he was and transported to modern day in the West, that he would be shocked for a number of reasons. But I think often I would assume that the way churches in the West have typically done church would surprise him to some degree. There might be things he would look at and be like, hey, this is good. And other things he'd look at and be like, this is weird. This is strange religion compared to what I'm used to. We both love the church. We know that it's not to like harp on the church. But I do think there are probably things in the Western church that would seem like strange religion to the early Christians. If you were to speculate, because we have no idea for sure, like what would be. Yeah. But in writing this book, you've kind of immersed yourself in this world for a while, so you have some idea. Your typical evangelical Western church, what would maybe be some things that if you took an early Christian and plopped them in a modern day evangelical Western church, what would seem weird or strange to them compared to what they were used to back in the early
we touched on it, so I'll say a couple of things. One of them we've already talked about. They would be surprised. I'm drawing off of my own experiences in churches. They'd be surprised that the majority of people in the church are just sitting there doing nothing. That's not that's, if, when Martin Luther translated the Bible in his time from Greek and Hebrew into German, at that time, it was only in Latin. But when he decided we need to give scripture to the people in their own language, there was a German word for church, Kirche, but he wanted to give, but when people think of church, he thought they think of a building with, pointy top.
Yeah.
So he thought, okay, I'm going to translate it as Gemeinde, which means, it literally means commonness, but we would say community. Gemeinde means community. And so I think walking into a church service and recognizing that that's what people consider as church, there would be almost shock and horror that the people aren't actually communing. If a community is designed to commune, and what you're doing is you're all facing one direction towards a stage with one or two people with a microphone, and sometimes you even darken the audience.
Yep.
And you say, okay, put them in the dark so they can better see the people in the light. I think they would think this is bizarre. Now you have to explain to them, okay, this is based on people watching theater. This is based on people going to movie theaters, things like that. They say, oh, I see. But why would you do that?
Yeah.
Why would you do that? And so we have a certain history of kind of a theatrical performative approach. So I think they would say, no, that's not what you're supposed to do. What I think, the other thing I think is, and again, this is more of my opinion. Once you get past like 100 people, it's actually really hard for it to be a community that communes, where you really know each other. And, I last night I went to this pub talk where I talked about strange religion. There's about 70 people there. We just had the greatest time talking. I spoke for about 35 minutes, and then we Q&A and discussion. They had table discussions. Just thought anything bigger than that, you're not going to have that feeling of being in this together.
Yeah.
So I think so the closest comparative to our big church services would be festivals, Jewish festivals. I think that's okay as long as you understand what that is. Okay, let's say once a month we gather for festivals. We have great music, great food, listen to great talks, but regularly you really got to come together. I think the big issue is, teaching, okay, train people. All right, second thing I think that they would recognize is, I think too much control over the service. I think that these house churches would make space for people to contribute by prayer requests, sharing, that sort of thing. But you have to have a small enough community where that's normal. In college, I went to a church, a small Nazarene church, maybe 50, 60 people. And the pastor would just say, who has prayer requests? And then people would stand up and share their prayer requests. Or the pastor would say, who has a need? And someone would say, oh, my car broke down. Can I get a lift to work? Oh yeah, I'll take care of you. That kind of thing. Like that would be I would think extremely natural in an early church. Would be like, okay, who has a need? Be like, you know what? My business is not doing well. Can I get, can someone loan me some bread? Like, oh, we'll just give it to you, take care of each other. I think that idea of a community that takes care of each other would be extremely natural in a house church setting that we can't replicate unless we put a heck of a lot of intention into our modern churches that really want to scale for size. And okay, yeah, we have small groups, but if it's not 99% participation in small groups, I think we're missing it. And then when we say come to church, you should mean the small group. Come to festival on Sunday morning.
Yeah, okay. That's that's interesting. I think too the fact that there's not even.
You're thinking of pushback, Aiden. That's okay. Talk to me.
No, I actually agree. I think it's really interesting. I don't know. The biggest thing that stood out to me when you were talking about when you first started talking about Greco-Roman kind of worship, and even what Israel would have been doing, and how different it was from what church was. I can already hear the modern day because I'm a pastor. I love church. I also have been in
Yeah.
these circles where I've said these things, but the temptation to be like, well, why don't we just do what the Romans are doing? Because that's what people want. We're like,
Yeah.
let's not do this weird thing where it's so awkward. Like, we could maybe have a more attractive gathering if we actually implemented some of the things that Rome is doing, or that Jews are used to doing, instead of just doing this weird thing. And how they didn't do that, they left it strange. And I think about the reason why for churches we're like, we want it to be more like a theater and like a concert, is because we're like, we want it to be what people are used to. We don't want it to seem so weird.
We want it to be entertaining.
Yeah, we don't want you to come and be bored, or like, why is Susie asking for this dumb prayer request again? We want to give some structure to it and give people something that doesn't feel strange. And how that actually would maybe be one of the biggest differences between what the early church was doing versus now in the Western evangelical church, is that they weren't too concerned about seeming weird or off-putting at first. And it's like, this is what we do because this is what church is, versus let's look at culture and actually imitate them more. Not to necessarily say that that's wrong. It's just really interesting to be like, that would be strange to them. They'd be like, this is weird. I don't fully know what to do with that. But it's an interesting thought.
I think what couple real quick comments, because I know we got to wrap up here. But I remember reading this Christianity article where immigrant pastors from other countries who come to the United States to minister were interviewed about what the difference is between church in their countries and in America. And several of them had said that they were surprised that pastors in America use the language of fun so much. Like, come to this event, it's going to be fun. Or I hope you had fun today. And they just said it never occurs to them that church should be fun. It's not really the goal of church. We want it to be filling. We want it to be maybe satisfying, but we don't necessarily want it to be fun. I remember going to an opening service for, a would-be mega church, and they had like people dressed as Elvis, like as valets, that sort of thing. And just the gimmicky kinds of stuff. I don't mind church being fun, but if that becomes the heart of it, because you want to keep people coming back for that, then you shift the mission to how do we keep people under these expectations. But just to wrap up, one of the things I think is the Christians did differently is, I think often when we create churches, we say, how can we start with the business model or start with the entertainment model and tweak it to make it Christian?
Yeah.
And what what our ancestors did in the first century is they build it from the ground up. They just said, I talk about it as a religious technology innovation, kind of like going from landlines to cell phones. They had the imagination and they had the grit to say, we're going to just build this completely differently. It's going to be a completely different thing. And it'll still be called religion, but it just looks completely different. And where they're willing to say it's not going to be for some people, and it's going to be weird to others, but we're really hoping it'll be compelling to those people that God is drawing to himself.
Nijay, thanks for doing this, man. I really want to read your book. And I hope that others do too. For those who maybe are wanting to support you in the work you're doing and the book, what's the best way for them to do that? How can they support you? How can they support the work you're doing?
Definitely check out the book Strange Religion, but also there are kind of inherent connections between that and my previous book, Tell Her Story. But if you want to kind of follow what I'm doing nowadays, my friend AJ Swoboda, he and I have a podcast called Slow Theology, where we're talking through a lot of the messy stuff of deconstruction, disenchantment, disappointment, doubt, and how to follow Jesus in the mess of real life and how to cling on to Jesus on the roller coaster of faith. And so we've been doing this for a few years. We're in a series right now on prayer. So check it out. AJ is just a brilliant theologian. I bring my thoughts from biblical studies, and it's just the two of us chatting most of the time about the kinds of things that we feel really uncomfortable talking about, but we really want to get those conversations out in the open. So Slow Theology, check it out.
That sounds great. Nijay, thanks for doing this, man. Really appreciate it. super fascinating conversations. So thanks for saying yes to coming on.
My pleasure. Nice to meet you.